I was standing ankle-deep in sticky mud on my great-great-aunt's old homestead, trying to ignore the roar of construction vehicles and the bright glare of camera flashes. A group of well-dressed HOA board members, most of them wearing self-satisfied grins, hurled glittering confetti into the air to celebrate the new commuter line they'd just finished. This track cut straight through my horse corral like some kind of trophy victory. Right in the center of it all stood Karen, yes, that Karen flute of champagne in hand, smugness practically oozing from her. She raised her glass to me as if we were old friends. "You can't stop progress," she called, voice echoing off metal rails. "Don't even bother trying." Her words flipped a switch in my head. What she couldn't have known was that a century ago, my family had engineered our own little piece of progress into the property records. It was a legal trap hidden and quietly waiting for someone reckless enough to trigger it. And Karen, with all her arrogance and bulldozers, just walked right into it. By the time I'd finished making calls and digging through dusty ledgers in the attic, I realized I could claim a lot more than a simple commuter line. If the plan worked, I'd own their newly built rails, their fancy HOA headquarters, and a whole chunk of the subdivision they'd been so proud of. And funny enough, foreclosure would be the nicest option on the list of consequences for them if you want to see how someone turns the tables on an entire HOA, snatching up their shiny new development project right from under their feet. Stick around. This story only gets more unbelievable from here, but before we dive in, I'd really appreciate if you could hit that like button. It helps the channel grow and lets us bring you even more crazy stories like this. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And hey, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers all over the world. Alright, let's get into it. It all began a month earlier when I was repairing some storm damage on my cousin's side of the ranch. Off in the distance, I noticed a bunch of folks in business attire milling around, scribbling on clipboards, and muttering to each other. At first, I figured they were from the local zoning office, maybe re-evaluating property lines or checking for flooding. That happens from time to time after big storms, but they kept hovering, clearly looking for something more than water damage. One woman stood out among them, tall, stern jaw, haircut so precise it might have been carved. She had a phone pressed to her ear and seemed to do all the talking. From the gestures she made, slicing the air with her hand, I could tell she was in charge, and that spelled trouble. Curious, I walked over to say hello. Before I could get more than a good morning, she thrust a stack of typed documents in my face and introduced herself as Karen, president of Juniper Hollow Homeowners Association. She rattled off something about a commuter rail extension they were building to connect their fancy new subdivision with the nearby city. Then she glanced at my stable yard and said, "We'll be running the tracks right through this section." She pointed at my corral, where 3 mares were lazing about, flicking FLIs off their tails. "Through my corral, you mean?" I replied, eyebrows raised. She grinned a fake grin. "Don't worry, it's all been cleared by our attorneys. You'll be paid fairly for the inconvenience. But let's not complicate matters. It's best if you let the professionals handle it." I'd never heard such arrogance in my life. Still, I tried to keep calm. I asked if they had county permits or if they'd consulted my family's deed records. She shrugged. "Our lawyers are very thorough," she said, patting my shoulder, like I was a clueless child. Then she turned back to her group and started describing where to pour gravel. Karen and company left soon after, leaving behind marked stakes and a swirl of dust. I stood there, fists clenched, thinking of my old Aunt Adeline's favorite saying, "They'll come for our land one day." We left them a little gift in the files. At the time, I never quite understood what she meant. Now I was getting an inkling. 2 weeks went by quietly, then, out of nowhere, a fleet of construction vehicles rumbled onto my property at dawn. They tore through a chunk of fencing, laid a bed of gravel, and hammered rail ties directly into my corral. Karen arrived with a pair of sidekicks, both crisp blouses, watchful eyes clapping at the progress. I watched from my porch, sipping coffee but not saying a thing. Let them do their victory dance, because that was the moment I remembered Aunt Adeline's cryptic remarks about a buried ace, something she said was hidden in the archives from the 1920s. If my memory was correct, it had to do with reversion rights or something about rail lines. So, as the bulldozers roared and the suits took photos, I went rummaging around in the attic, searching for old trunks stuffed with dusty ledgers. Sure enough, I found a battered leather-bound book with Oak and Dale Trust 1922 revision stamped in gold leaf. Inside, half buried under receipts for livestock feed, I discovered the exact clause Aunt Adeline once hinted at. Should any railway or commercial access path be built upon the Oakendale Trust lands Parcel 7C without explicit approval from the Trust, all properties connecting to said unauthorized structure become subject to reacquisition by the Oakendale Trust after 30 days of continuous encroachment. It took me reading it 3 times before I realized what it truly meant. The unauthorized structure part? That was the new commuter rail they'd just decided to lay across my corral. The properties connecting to said structure. That described Juniper Hollow, their entire planned subdivision. In other words, they'd waltzed in and activated a legal time bomb. All I had to do was wait 30 days, not lift a finger, and the reversion clause would kick in. The easiest revenge I'd ever get. But also the slowest 30 days of my life. I raced down to the county recorder's office first thing the next morning. A dear friend who works there, Melinda, helped me pull relevant documents. She whistled when she saw the original trust clause. "This is like a land torpedo," she joked. "You just lock onto them, wait, and let the law do the rest." After making copies and verifying the records, I thanked Melinda and headed home to watch the show. Meanwhile, Karen started sending me snotty letters. One criticized me for unsightly livestock odor drifting into Juniper Hollow. Another threatened fines unless I complied with the commuter route beautification plan, which involved removing my corral entirely. They were petty little jabs meant to scare me or bury me in paperwork, but each one only strengthened my resolve. Let them hammer their rails, celebrate their big plans. They had no clue the old land trust was about to devour everything they'd built. I began documenting every step they took, date stamping photos of the rail line, filming them expanding beyond their supposed boundary, because the key was proving that they'd trespassed without permission for a full 30 days. No more, no less. Then the clause kicked in. 3 weeks later, the rails were essentially finished. Karen invited local media to a ribbon-cutting, acting like it was some grand achievement. They popped champagne while standing on dusty wooden TIs anchored in my corral. My horses watched from a distance, flicking their ears in confusion at all the ruckus. I leaned on a fence post, phone camera rolling. Karen caught sight of me, raised her glass, and smirked. "I told you there's nothing you can do about it," she yelled above the cheering. Progress marches on, whether you like it or not. I just kept smiling, thinking, keep talking, Karen. Keep making this easy. That night, I studied the old trust records again. The 30-day mark was fast approaching, just 3 more days. During that window, I discovered an even deeper gem, an addendum Aunt Adeline added in 1930, clarifying that once reversion triggered, the trust wouldn't just have a claim on the railroad right-of-way, but also any connected development that used it. In other words, if Juniper Hollow planned to use that commuter line for convenience, they'd default to the Oakendale Trust as well. All the homes, the fancy received center, even the roads they'd built around the line. The entire subdivision could be seized, leaving them basically homeless or renting from me. I didn't want to blindside them entirely. I wanted them to know they were in trouble. So, the morning after the champagne fiasco, I had my lawyer friend, Vera Hill, draft a polite letter to Karen. It laid out the Oakendale Trust clause, explained how they triggered it, and gave them a 72-hour window to rectify the violation or face reversion. We sent the letter certified mail. 3 days away from the big 30. Perfect timing. Mid-afternoon, I saw Karen in her Honda, parked near the rail line, pacing back and forth. Phone pressed to her ear as she yelled, probably at her attorneys, or maybe at the county. Then she spotted me and stomped over to the fence. She demanded I tear up the letter, calling it outdated nonsense. I leaned on the gate, expression calm, and shrugged. "It's older than both of us. If you wanted to avoid it, maybe you should read the records." She stormed off, cursing under her breath. Next, the HOA called an emergency meeting, presumably to decide how to handle my letter. Vera and I showed up uninvited but determined. The board sat at long tables in a stuffy conference room, flipping through printed copies of my documents. Karen pretended to ignore us, but she'd occasionally shoot me a glare so fierce it could curdle milk. Eventually, their treasurer, a man named Glenn, asked, "How serious is this reversion clause? Can we challenge it?" I leaned forward. "You can try in court, but it'll cost you millions and you'll likely lose. The county records are clear." Karen tried to interrupt, claiming it was all an extreme misinterpretation. But my lawyer, Vera, calmly laid out the evidence. She showed them the original 1922 revision, the 1930 addendum, the transcripts proving they'd built a rail line on our land without a formal easement, and the fact that a full month had passed. Their sweaty faces told me the meltdown was beginning. People started murmuring about selling their houses before the whole place got swallowed up in legal chaos. Karen slammed a gavel, yelling for order, shouting something about a minor contract. Oversight, but we had them cornered. The moment those rails touched my corral, they'd kick the reversion countdown into motion. That evening, Karen tried one last intimidation stunt. She and a group of HOA enforcers, basically 3 guys in matching polo shirts, came to my ranch with a county official in tow, claiming I was in serious violation of erosion guidelines. They pointed to some dirt piles near the railbed. The official looked uncomfortable, like he'd been dragged into a feud he didn't understand. I stayed polite, offered them iced tea, then handed them a set of county documents confirming that my land was well within code. I also showed them the footage of the bulldozers that had actually created the dirt piles. Karen turned beet red, sputtering about how I was obstructing a community necessity. I walked them back to the property line and said, "I'm just following the law. You folks might try it sometime." The official muttered an apology and left, shrugging at Karen. Score 1 more point for the Oakendale Trust. At dawn on the 31st day, Vera and I filed the final reversion claim with the county clerk. We submitted every scrap of evidence, timelines, photos, the trust clause, and the unanswered 72-hour notice. By law, Juniper Hollow's entire commuter line was now subject to confiscation, along with the roads that fed into it, plus any property reliant on that line. When the news hit, it was like dropping a grenade in their fancy lakeside clubhouse. Karen tried to call an urgent vote to forcibly remove the rail or pay me off, but it was too late. The county recognized our claim. They scheduled a hearing to finalize it. Meanwhile, local homeowners panicked. They bombarded my phone with calls wanting to know if they'd lose their houses, if they'd owe me rent. Some cursed at me. Others begged for mercy. I mostly stayed quiet, letting the law run its course. Because I had a plan, and it didn't involve throwing families onto the street unless they left me no choice, Karen's meltdown grew intense. She started telling residents I was an evil rancher bent on destroying their property values for profit. But then Vera uncovered something else in the HOA's finances. They'd used association dues to pay for personal luxuries, calling them infrastructure improvements. That alone was grounds for dissolution of the HOA. It seemed Karen had been playing petty tyrant for a while, and this commuter line scheme was her biggest overreach yet. We filed a complaint about misappropriated funds. The county commissioners quickly took interest. Suddenly, Karen's worst nightmare wasn't just me seizing the railway. It was a full-blown investigation into HOA corruption. On the day of the hearing, I walked into the courthouse in my dusty boots and a clean white shirt, escorted by Vera. Karen was already there, arms crossed, glaring at me with pure hatred. The judge, a steely woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, cut to the chase. She reviewed the trust clause, the unapproved construction, and the 30-day threshold they'd crossed. She examined the HOA's charter for anything that might override the trust. There was nothing. Karen babbled about the importance of progress, how I was holding the community hostage. The judge set down her reading glasses and said, "You built a railway on land that isn't yours without permission. That's called trespassing in plain language." Then she ruled in my favor. The commuter line now belonged to the Oakendale Trust. So did the roads branching off it. The stunned faces of the HOA board were priceless, but the fireworks weren't. Over. The judge also granted an injunction against the HOA's enforcement powers pending the fraud investigation. Effectively, the entire board was neutered. They couldn't levy fines, pass new rules, or do anything but watch as the reversion claim took shape. Karen looked like she wanted to vanish into the floor. The next morning, I installed a wrought iron gate at the main entrance into Juniper Hollow with a sign that read, "Private property of the Oakendale Trust. Access by permit only." I wasn't blocking emergency services or anything like that. I left a separate lane open for fire and rescue, but for everyday driving, folks had to pay a small yearly fee if they wanted the right to cross. I set it at $300 a household, which was still less than the crazy dues Karen used to charge for community beautification. The first person who called to complain was no surprise Karen. She shouted that it was daylight robbery, I calmly explained it was no different than her endless fines for mailbox color or excessive leaf blowers. She hung up. Rs. Word spread, some homeowners scrambled to sell their properties and run, but the local real estate scene knew about the fiasco, so offers were lowball at best. Others swallowed their pride and paid me for an access permit, hoping the dust would settle. A few actually seemed relieved that Karen's tyranny was at an end. They even apologized for the stress I'd endured. The local paper ran a front-page story titled HOA Plans Backfire, Rancher Reclaims Neighborhood. It was a fair summary. Meanwhile, Vera was busy rummaging through more old records. She discovered that decades ago, Karen's group forced multiple families out with shady fines, took their homes, and resold them at a profit. Some of those families were people my Aunt Adeline had been friends with, so I decided to track them down. For those who were interested, I offered them a chance to buy back their old homes from us, the trust, at a reasonable price. If they'd found new lives elsewhere, I understood, but the option was there, and that gesture alone felt like poetic justice. The final blow came when we realized the Juniper Hollow clubhouse, an opulent building with a fancy pool and members only spa, had been built partially on the same corridor that the commuter line used. With reversion triggered, that land was also under the trust's domain. In simpler terms, I now legally owned their clubhouse. I served official notice that the Oakendale Trust was assuming management of the building. If they wanted to keep using it, they'd have to pay a modest membership fee. Some folks complained, but many saw the upside. I was charging far less than Karen ever did. More neighbors recognized that the transformation was fairer than the old HOA rules. I even took down the forbidding gate that used to block the pull to certain undesirable families. As for Karen herself, her meltdown was a spectacle. First, she tried to rally a new action committee to fight me in court, but nobody wanted to pay the legal fees. Next, she cornered me in the new trust office, screaming about how I'd ruined her life, how I'd regret this. She threatened to sue me personally for emotional distress. I told her I'd see her in court, but she didn't have a leg to stand on. Her last desperate move was to fabricate some nonsense about me violating city codes by having excess animals, but city inspectors took one look and shrugged it off. My ranch animals were well below the maximum for the acreage. Defeated, Karen eventually listed her home for sale, though rumor says she lost a fortune in the process. I never saw her again. She faded away like a bad memory, presumably relocating somewhere with no land trust to cross. Over the months that followed, the Oakendale Trust carefully restructured Juniper Hollow. Gone were Karen's petty fines. In their place, we offered simple guidelines that actually helped the community. Keep your yards clean, no harassment of neighbors, basic courtesy. We converted the commuter line into a small-scale local rail for farmers and crafters to transport goods more easily to the city. A local group of orchard growers pitched in, and the track is now known as Oakendale Orchard Express. For the clubhouse, I gave it a rebrand, the Oakendale Gathering Hall. On weekends, folks can host rummage sales, potluck dinners, or even small concerts. The swimming pool remains open to local kids who once feared stepping foot near it for fear of a dreaded HOA violation. People started smiling more, talking to each other without glancing over their shoulders. The gloom lifted. Sure, not everyone's happy. Some stubborn types remain bitter about the changes, but the fear-based regime Karen built is gone, replaced by a sense of shared ownership. The folks who refused to adapt sold their houses at a discount and left. New families moved in, drawn by the fresh atmosphere of cooperation rather than pettiness. Every now and then, I think of Aunt Adeline, how she always said the day would come when we'd have to defend the land. She and her siblings wrote that reversion clause as a final shield against the unstoppable march of outsiders who couldn't respect what was here. Maybe it was a little extreme, but it worked like a charm. I visit her gravesite sometimes, bringing wildflowers from the meadow. I'll sit by her marker under the oak tree that gave our trust its name, sipping my coffee or sweet tea, telling her the latest neighborhood gossip. I can almost imagine her laughing at the thought of Karen's meltdown. She'd probably say, "See, we knew someone would try, and we knew you'd finish it for us," because that's the real heart of this story. It's about a piece of land my family has held for generations, shaped by storms, cattle, and quiet evenings by the creek. A place that outsiders assumed was just raw dirt to be paved over for profit. But Adeline and the others had the foresight to bury a legal bomb in the deed, ensuring no big talkers could stomp on our legacy. All it took was the right conditions, namely Karen's arrogance, to set it off. Months later, Vera and I sat on folding chairs at the old orchard near the railroad, watching a local folk band play for a small crowd. Some folks danced, kids chased each other. A couple from the community center sold homemade pies and cold lemonade. The orchard smelled of apples and warm grass. In the distance, we could see my corral, safe from any more bulldozers. A neighbor named Glenda, once fiercely loyal to Karen, wandered over shyly. She said, "I never believed you'd do something good with all that power." "I'm sorry I misjudged you." I waved it off. We all want the same thing in the end, a place we can call home, without fear or greed overshadowing it. When night fell, we lit lanterns and let them drift upward. The soft glow bobbed against a starry sky, marking a new day for our ranch and for the families who learned the hard way that unstoppable progress still has to respect old boundaries. Some watchers cheered, others fell silent in awe. From where I sat, I could see the rails glinting in the moonlight, part of the land now, serving the people instead of dividing them. If that's not poetic justice, I don't know what is. And as for Karen, well, last I heard, she was living in a cramped condo somewhere, complaining about the neighbor's choice of window drapes. I suppose old habits die hard. But out here, on the Oakendale Ranch, we're too busy enjoying the peace to worry about that. We've got horses to feed, an orchard line to run, and a community that's learning to live without the chokehold of a petty HOA. For me, that's victory enough.